Foodfight was a film doomed from the start. For those unfamiliar with the $64 million travesty, it was a film directed by Lawrence Kasdanov, and its production began in 2002 as a franchise that could go toe-to-toe with the likes of Pixar's Toy Story. When the aim of a project is to go toe-to-toe with industry giants not unlike Halo, Marvel Studios, or in this case Pixar's flagship series, it tends to not turn out well for the work for a varying amount of reasons. Most of what troubled this film's production stems from its director, who had no prior experience with animated films, and it will be very clear that he had absolutely no knowledge whatsoever of how it differs from live film. When making any animated content, there is a sizable chunk of time that goes into the pre-production of it. Character design, script writing, concept art, and for this focus of the segment, the storyboard. Storyboards are where the animated film begins to truly take shape. Then it gets cut into an animatic to test out how the film should look and see how it unfolds. This is where things are fairly easy to change. If the writers and director don't like how a scene fits into the story, it's easy to toss it out. Heck, storyboards are often roughed out on sticky notes so they can easily be moved around and switched out. So what does this have to do with Foodfight's production? Well, according to the accounts of animators that worked on the project, the director would ask them to change how things played out after they fully animated a scene. This is very inefficient because they've spent hours at times making a scene. Animation takes time. Throwing out finished animation is a big cost sink, and there will be a lot of cost sinks among this production. That said, there was even more difficulties with the direction of animation, specifically how his lack of knowledge about animating made a severe breakdown in communications. He would often say, make this shot more awesome or 30% better. These bits of advice don't really help animators. When directing animation, you need to speak their language in order to clearly give them direction. If a movement is coming out too fast, tell them to put some more anticipation or slow down their timing. If they're not exaggerating the movements enough, tell them to push the poses more. Anything other than that vague phrasing. Look, I understand that he did not know very much about animation, but he wanted to make an animated film, which is fine. The thing is, you should probably hire somebody who knows how to talk to animators, like an animation director. Alas, that never happened, and things would only get worse for the production. This gap in communication would only widen after the film lost its old discs in a bout of quote-unquote industrial sabotage. In a fit of inspiration, Kasdanov decided to implement the use of motion capture in the film. While motion capture does have its uses, for the film's initial visual direction, it was a massive hindrance. Initially, Mr. Kasdanov intended for the animation to resemble the highly exaggerated and squashy animation of the Looney Tunes, which would be somewhat of a challenge for animation of that era. In order to have that level of squash and stretch, you would need high-poly models and specialized rigs that allow for those kinds of movements in the first place. Rigs that don't really lend themselves to motion capture. In fact, exaggerated movements and squashy animation is the opposite of what motion capture is good for, that being naturalistic animation. Nowadays, mocap is frequently used in live-action films for CG characters that need to interact with real people, or video games which often strive for hyperrealism. Yet, this was not all, as it turns out that the motion capture system itself was very restrictive, since the gear required the head to remain still, leading to very unemotive initial passes of animation, which in turn required the animators to go in and liven up the captured animation. Now, when doing mocap, yeah, you do have to clean up the animation, but that's usually to make it smoother, not completely override it and go in, because When you switch from motion capture to hand-done animation, it's all the more jarring, save for one single character. Cheezel T. Weasel, more commonly known as the Poop Rat. For whatever reason, his animation is actually somewhat good. Heck, even his textures seem to be a bit better than most of the cast. Though that's not good, mind you. But what they're actually doing is classic squash and stretch. He was clearly hand animated, you can tell by the movement, there's a lot of really good posing, there's a lot of arcs to it, it's clearly well and deliberate, and that's probably because the character couldn't be mocapped in the first place given his non-human build. So you do get this glimpse of what could have been, but again, it's not very good. The highlights on his fur make him look like, well, a wet turd, hence the Poop Rat name. Another big hurdle for the film was that they also changed animation programs halfway through. Instead of using the unspecified program that they had before, which was a very generalist-centric program, they used Autodesk Maya, which is more suited towards specialists. So Kassanov would go around wondering why animators couldn't do texturing, why modelers couldn't do animation, and that's mostly because Maya does have setups that are conducive towards certain tasks. For example, texturing is its own little set of windows, animation has its own set of features and windows, same with modeling. When you try to get one person to do another thing in Maya, it becomes a little difficult. I have worked with Maya myself, and while it is a good program, it's good when used properly. Evidently, Kassanov had no idea how it was used properly, but ultimately, there was not much more time to really come to grips with it, as around 2009, it was time for the film to be finished. The investors had had enough of this because the budget was bloated by trying to get the licenses renewed for all of the characters that were to appear in the film. So they had it finished, they shipped it out, and it released to next to no advertising and a very limited theatrical release, if at all. It is mostly found now as DVDs. However, even if it wasn't sabotaged halfway through, the script, the core backbone of the film, is very weak. It's riddled with blatant adult jokes that put off people, and the story itself is this wonky mess with a host of issues. The first being that the world that it takes place in makes no sense. You see, the story is set in a grocery store that at night transforms into this fantastical dimension where all the icons, in this case called Ikes, reside for each of the products. And this world is not actually a separate thing. It is somewhat coterminous with reality. The characters can go in and out sometimes, but not always. It is very bizarre and never consistent. To contrast, let's look at Toy Story, which has a very simple and easy to understand premise. Your toys come alive when you're not looking. They will only ever show themselves to you if you've really pissed them off. Simple, easy to understand, and is pretty much the premise of the film. Is it the story of the film? No, but it does frame it, and that simplicity is what makes it work. This film has a whole bunch of rules that are not explained, and it just makes it all the more confusing, especially when the film itself is kind of a murder mystery. But it's not much of a mystery because, let's face it, Lady X was behind the disappearances of all those Ikes. From here, we should really discuss the absolute cardboard display that is the cast. I mean, you don't have to have the tightest world building to make a good film, no. That's just irritating. Now, having a cast that's flatter than tissue paper is just going to make a slog of a film. Let's run down some of the cast. Starting with Dex Dogtective. If his blank stares didn't convince you that he was soulless, Charlie Sheen's absolute flat performance will. The chocolate squirrel guy can best be summarized as unsolicited chocolate puns with even more sexual innuendos. Sunshine Goodness is the biggest case of uncanny valley in a maid love interest since Princess Elise, and she has even less depth than her. As for Lady X herself, the main antagonist, she is a walking series of sexual innuendos. However, she's probably the only character that has an ounce of depth to her, so strap in because we are heading into spoiler territory, if anybody cares about the movie being spoiled like 8 years or so after its release. The first thing that you need to know about Lady X is that she's not actually the Ike for Brand X. She was actually the Ike for a brand of prunes that was also an old woman. Of course, nobody wanted to buy those prunes, so she went out and got plastic surgery. Somehow. Then, she made a human-sized robot to take her to other stores to distribute Brand X. Somehow. You know, it would just have been easier to make her the Ike for Brand X and nothing else. Seriously, the weird prune lady backstory just complicates matters. Like, Brand X is supposed to be like this big conglomerate type set of products that just dominates everything else. Why not simply make her this shallow Barbie doll-like caricature that ultimately cares for no one and just manipulates others to her own benefit? It makes things much more simple. That said, the robot itself, Mr. Clipboard, was hilarious, and it's sad that they didn't add faint whirring sounds to foreshadow that he was in fact a robot. There's just a whole bunch of disappointment in this film. In summary, the director had no clue how to efficiently make an animated film, which resulted in very poor animation. The film's script was a uninteresting mystery plot filled to the brim with really poor adult jokes and shallow characters. Even if the film wasn't sabotaged during the initial production, I doubt that it would have been very successful. Sure, it probably wouldn't be the massive $65 million flop that it is today. It probably would have just been a $21 to $30 million flop instead. The director wanted to make this film the one that unseats Toy Story from its throne, but ultimately made a film that's more of a rite of passage for animation reviewers in the mid-2010s. That's going to do it for this first installment of Doomed from the Start. If anyone has absolute disasters of films, video games, or TV shows that they'd like to see discussed in this new series, leave a comment, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications so you can see when new videos get released.
Survival of the fittest, leather.